There is a moment in every life when the noise fades. No more applause, no more arguments, no more clever explanations, just silence. And it is in that silence that a narcissist begins to break. Not publicly, not dramatically, not in some theatrical confession that everyone can see, but privately, in the dark, when the house is still, when the television is off, when the phone is no longer lighting up with distractions. That is when the soul begins to speak. For years, they could outrun reflection. They could drown it in busyness, in admiration, in new relationships, in control. But there comes a season, and many of you watching know exactly what I mean, when God removes the noise, and what remains is the echo of what they have done. This is where the breakdown begins. Not because someone attacked them, not because someone exposed them, but because conscience has finally been allowed to breathe. And once conscience begins to speak, it does not whisper politely. It repeats. It reminds. It replays. The narcissist who once seemed untouchable now lies awake, staring at the ceiling, not because someone is threatening them, but because their own memory is. The night is no longer quiet. The mind becomes a courtroom. There was a time when they could sleep. Sleep after harsh words. Sleep after betrayal. Sleep after watching you cry and telling themselves it was necessary. They slept because they had constructed a story that protected them. In that story, they were misunderstood. In that story, you were too sensitive. In that story, their choices were justified. But something has shifted. Now, the night is no longer quiet. When the house settles and the last light turns off, something else turns on. The mind. And the mind, when no longer defended by ego, becomes a courtroom. Not a courtroom filled with public accusation, not a courtroom of social embarrassment, but a courtroom of memory. Every dismissed conversation returns as testimony. They hear your voice again, not distorted, not reframed, but as it truly sounded. Calm. Wounded. Trying. They replay the moment you said, "This is hurting me." They replay the silence that followed when they chose not to respond. They replay the look on your face the last time you realized they were not going to change. And for the first time, they are not narrating it as the hero. They are sitting in the defendant's chair. This is what happens when distraction is removed. For years, they relied on noise. Work noise, relationship noise, attention noise, conflict noise. But in the stillness of 2 or 3 a.m., there is no applause, no validation, no one to agree with their version. Only conscience. And conscience does not argue loudly. It repeats quietly, over and over, like a steady gavel tapping against the bench. You see, many narcissists believe they are strong because they can dominate a room, but strength is not measured by control over others. It is measured by the ability to endure truth about oneself. And that is where they are failing. Because truth is now presenting evidence they can no longer suppress. They remember the manipulation. They remember twisting facts. They remember intentionally withholding affection to gain leverage. And what makes it unbearable is not that they were caught. It is that they now see it clearly. Clarity is destabilizing for someone who has lived in distortion. The Apostle Paul speaks of the law written on the heart, conscience bearing witness. You do not have to preach to them. You do not have to confront them. There is a divine design within every human being that recognizes right from wrong, and when that recognition is no longer numbed, it becomes heavy. Very heavy. At first, they try to resist it. They turn on the television. They scroll through their phone. They reach for distraction. But eventually, the room grows quiet again, and the gavel resumes. They begin asking questions they never asked before. Was I unfair? Did I go too far? Did I lose something I cannot replace? These are not comfortable questions for someone who built their identity on superiority, because superiority cannot coexist with guilt. And guilt, once acknowledged, cracks the illusion of perfection. Now imagine the weight of years. Years of small manipulations. Years of pride. Years of insisting they were right while others were wrong. Those years gather like files stacked on a prosecutor's table. One by one, they are opened. One by one, they are examined. Not by you, not by the public, but by their own memory. And here is the most profound part. They are not afraid of punishment. They are afraid of exposure to themselves. Because if they admit the truth internally, they must face something deeper. They hurt someone who loved them. They dismissed someone who was loyal. They treated care as weakness. And now that loyalty is gone. Now that love has withdrawn. Now that the person who prayed for them has stepped away, the courtroom feels final. There is no appeal. There is no new narrative to write. There is only consequence unfolding slowly inside the mind. For a narcissist, this is suffocating, because they have spent a lifetime externalizing blame. Now blame has nowhere to go, and so it circles back. This is why they cannot sleep. Not because someone is attacking them, not because of superstition, but because the human soul was not designed to permanently silence truth. Truth eventually demands acknowledgement, and when it does, it robs the night of peace. They may never admit this publicly. They may still appear composed during the day, but you would be astonished at the conversations happening in the dark. The rehearsed apologies they never send, the imagined scenarios where they try to rewrite history, the internal debates where they attempt once more to justify themselves, only to feel the argument weaken. The courtroom remains open, and the longer it stays open, the harder it becomes to ignore the verdict forming. For someone who thrived on control, this is collapse. Narcissism survives on control, not merely control of situations, but control of perception, control of how they are seen, control of how they are remembered, control of how events are interpreted. For years, they curated reality the way some people curate photographs, carefully edited, selectively framed, filtered to eliminate flaw. But control requires constant energy. It is a performance sustained by vigilance. You must monitor tone. You must anticipate criticism. You must silence dissent. You must manage impressions. And eventually, the cost of that performance becomes unsustainable. What we are witnessing now is not a sudden emotional outburst. It is structural fatigue. The architecture of illusion is beginning to crack. During the day, they may still present composure. They may still speak confidently. They may still appear decisive. They may still insist they are unbothered. But beneath that exterior, something is unraveling. Because control begins to collapse when two things happen. First, when the person they once controlled is no longer responding. Second, when their internal narrative stops cooperating. You see, control over others often masks lack of control within. When you stopped engaging in their cycles, when you stopped defending yourself, explaining yourself, chasing their approval, you removed a stabilizing element from their system. You were not weak. You were their regulator. Your reactions fed their sense of importance. Your emotional energy reinforced their power. Your attempts to fix the relationship kept the dynamic alive. When you stepped away, you did more than leave. You disrupted their structure. And without that external reinforcement, the internal instability surfaces. This is when panic sets in, not dramatic panic, but subtle, gnawing unease. They begin to sense that something is slipping. Their charm feels less effective. Their new relationships feel thinner. Their arguments feel repetitive. They notice patterns they once blamed on others. For someone who built identity on dominance, this is terrifying, because dominance requires opposition. If you are no longer there to push against, who are they dominating? And if they cannot dominate, who are they? The Apostle James writes that God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Pride builds walls, but walls eventually trap the builder. The narcissist constructed emotional walls to prevent vulnerability. Now, those same walls amplify their isolation. They thought control would protect them from pain. Instead, it insulated them from intimacy. Now they are left with power but no connection. Influence, but no trust. Appearance, but no peace. Control begins to collapse when they realize that people comply less willingly. Friends withdraw subtly. Colleagues stop validating every claim. New partners sense inconsistency. The admiration is no longer effortless. And without effortless admiration, they must exert more force. But force reveals insecurity. And insecurity is the one thing they swore they did not possess. This is why they are breaking down. Not because life suddenly attacked them, but because the system they depended on is failing. Control is exhausting when you must constantly maintain it, and exhaustion weakens illusion. At night, when they lie awake, they begin to confront a frightening possibility. They may not be as powerful as they believed. They may not be as justified as they claimed. They may not be as irreplaceable as they assumed. This recognition destabilizes identity, because narcissism is not merely behavior. It is a fragile structure protecting a wounded self. When control collapses, that wounded self becomes visible, and vulnerability without humility feels like threat. They are not grieving the loss of control over you. They are grieving the loss of certainty about themselves. They sense that their tactics are no longer working the way they once did. They sense that respect cannot be commanded forever. They sense that admiration fades when character is absent, and that awareness creates fear. For someone who equated control with safety, loss of control feels like exposure. Exposure feels like danger, and danger triggers panic. But here is the deeper truth. This collapse is not cruelty. It is correction. A life built on manipulation cannot sustain itself indefinitely. Eventually, the foundation shifts. Eventually, the weight of performance becomes unbearable. Eventually, the persona fractures under the strain of reality. And when it fractures, what remains is not a monster. It is a human being confronted with truth. The tragedy is not that they are breaking down. The tragedy is that they mistook control for strength. Real strength is the ability to confess. Real strength is the ability to admit fault. Real strength is the willingness to change. But narcissistic control resists all three. So instead of humility, they experience collapse. Instead of surrender, they experience unraveling. Instead of confession, they experience sleeplessness, because control, once lost, reveals what was always beneath it, fragility, and fragility without faith is frightening. This is why their nights are restless, because the illusion of invincibility is gone, and they are left facing themselves without armor. Final judgment, not emotion, but consequence. We must pause here and understand something that many people misunderstand about judgment. Final judgment is not an outburst of divine anger. It is not a sudden explosion of punishment falling from the sky. It is not dramatic thunder, nor is it emotional retaliation. Final judgment is consequence reaching maturity. It is a seed fully grown. For years, the narcissist planted seeds, small seeds at first. A dismissive comment here, a calculated silence there, a manipulation disguised as wisdom, a betrayal justified as necessity. Each choice felt manageable in the moment. Each decision seemed minor. But Scripture reminds us that sowing is cumulative. You may not see the harvest immediately, but harvest is patient, and harvest is precise. When we speak of final judgment on their life, we are describing the moment when the accumulated weight of their choices becomes undeniable. They are not being surprised by something foreign. They are confronting something familiar, their own pattern. The narcissist believed consequences could be negotiated. They believed charm could override accountability. They believed time would erase memory, but time does not erase. Time reveals. For decades, they may have operated under the illusion that they were exempt, that other people suffered consequences, but they would always maneuver around them, that they were clever enough, persuasive enough, strategic enough to avoid full reckoning. But here is the sobering truth for anyone watching in their 50s or 60s. Character compounds. You cannot plant pride and expect peace. You cannot plant deception and expect trust. You cannot plant selfishness and expect intimacy. The law of spiritual cause and effect does not bend to personality. It bends to truth. And truth does not rush. It waits. Final judgment arrives quietly. It arrives when they realize relationships are no longer repairing themselves. It arrives when apologies no longer work. It arrives when the same conflicts repeat with different people. It arrives when respect becomes thinner and admiration feels forced. It arrives when they sense that something irreversible has occurred, not because someone cursed them, but because they have exhausted the grace extended to them. Many of you understand the concept of divine patience. God does not immediately strike down wrongdoing. He allows space. Space for repentance, space for awareness, space for change. But when space is ignored long enough, consequences solidify. The narcissist mistook patience for approval. They mistook silence for endorsement. They mistook mercy for weakness, and so they continued. Now the accumulated result of those continuations stands before them. It is not dramatic, it is sobering. They begin to notice something unsettling. Opportunities close. Trust does not return. Doors remain shut. The same people who once defended them grow quiet. And in that quiet, they begin to understand. Final judgment is not emotional chaos. It is structural. It is the collapse of what was never sustainable. The Apostle Paul writes that a person is given over to the desires they insist upon. That is perhaps the most frightening form of judgment, not being forcibly corrected, but being allowed to fully experience the outcome of your own path. The narcissist insisted on control. Now they live in isolation. They insisted on superiority. Now they struggle with insecurity. They insisted on domination. Now they find themselves alone in rooms where no one listens. Judgment is not God losing his temper. It is God allowing reality to speak without interruption. For the narcissist, this is devastating, because they built their identity on external validation. When validation fades, they are left with internal reality. And internal reality is less flattering. They begin to see that they have damaged connections beyond repair. They begin to realize that some bridges, once burned repeatedly, do not rebuild. They begin to sense that the person they dismissed was not replaceable. This is not cruelty. This is culmination. And culmination feels final. That is why it is called final judgment. Not because God is vindictive, but because the cycle has reached its logical conclusion. They cannot return to the innocence of ignorance. They cannot claim they did not know. They cannot rewrite history again. They are facing the full picture. For someone who relied on partial truths, the full picture is overwhelming. And here is the most sobering part. Final judgment does not always destroy a person publicly. Sometimes it simply strips away illusion privately. Sometimes it removes admiration, Sometimes it removes influence. Sometimes it removes the ability to pretend. The narcissist now understands that what they dismissed as weakness was strength. They understand that loyalty is rare. They understand that trust, once broken repeatedly, does not regenerate on command. They understand that their choices have narrowed their future. And that narrowing feels like confinement. This is why they are breaking down. Because the myth of invulnerability has expired, and the truth of accountability has arrived, not loudly, not violently, but steadily. Final judgment is not chaos. It is clarity. It is the moment when the harvest stands before the farmer, and the farmer recognizes the crop. For the believer watching, there is reassurance in this. You do not need to engineer justice. You do not need to manipulate outcomes. You do not need to force revelation. The moral order of the universe is not asleep. It is precise, and precision may take years, but it does not fail. The narcissist is not suffering because you wished it. They are facing consequence because they cultivated it. And consequence, when fully grown, does not ask permission. God is keeping them awake. What that truly means. When we say God is keeping them awake, we must understand this in its deepest and most mature sense. We are not speaking of superstition. We are not describing some dramatic spiritual spectacle. We are speaking of something far more sobering. We are speaking of divine permission for truth to surface. There comes a point in a person's life when distraction no longer works. When entertainment no longer numbs, when new relationships no longer silence memory, when success no longer drowns out conscience, and in that moment, sleep becomes difficult, not because God is cruel, but because God is merciful. Yes, merciful, because unrest is often the first signal that the soul is still alive. A person who feels nothing after causing harm is far more lost than a person who lies awake, replaying what they have done. The narcissist built a life around avoidance of responsibility, avoidance of vulnerability, avoidance of humility. But avoidance cannot continue indefinitely. Eventually, silence grows louder than noise. At night, when the lights are off and there is no one to impress, no one to manipulate, no one to argue with, their own thoughts become unavoidable. They hear echoes. They see scenes. They remember words spoken in frustration, words that now sound harsher than they did at the time. They remember the look in your eyes. They remember the moment you stopped fighting for the relationship, and the weight of that realization presses against their chest. For years, they believed they were in control of the narrative. They told themselves you were the problem. They convinced others you were too sensitive. They framed themselves as misunderstood. But in the stillness of night, there is no audience. There is only conscience. And conscience is not easily silenced once awakened. God does not need to shout. He simply removes the insulation. He allows memory to remain clear. He allows clarity to persist. He allows the heart to feel what it once suppressed. And that is enough to keep a person awake, especially someone who has spent years refusing reflection. For those of you watching in midlife, you understand this deeply. You know that peace at night is one of life's greatest blessings. To lie down and rest without mental rehearsal, without regret replaying, without unresolved guilt circling, that is a gift. And when that gift is disturbed, it signals something significant. The narcissist is not tormented by superstition. They are unsettled by truth. They are realizing that what they dismissed as weakness in you was actually strength. They are realizing that what they called overreaction was pain. They are realizing that their decisions had weight, and weight presses hardest in quiet hours. This sleeplessness is not random. It is a reckoning with reality. It is the discomfort of a conscience that has finally been allowed to speak. And for someone who built identity on superiority, hearing that inner voice say, "You were wrong," is destabilizing. God is not keeping them awake to destroy them. He is keeping them awake because transformation begins with awareness. Whether they accept that awareness is another matter, but the unrest itself is evidence that the moral order of the universe still functions. Truth does not disappear. It waits, and when it is no longer resisted, it interrupts sleep, not violently, but persistently. And that persistence is often the beginning of judgment, not as punishment, but as revelation. They are realizing what they lost. There is a particular kind of realization that arrives slowly. It does not strike like lightning. It seeps in. It begins as a passing thought, then becomes a quiet suspicion, then settles into undeniable recognition. They are realizing what they lost. Not in theory, not as a dramatic confession, but in comparison. Comparison is powerful. When they speak to someone new and feel the absence of depth, when they share a story and notice a lack of understanding, when they face difficulty and sense there is no one praying quietly for their strength, that is when realization begins. You were not just a partner. You were stability. You were loyalty in an era of convenience. You were someone who chose covenant when culture preferred exit. For many, watching in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, you understand the rarity of that. You know how uncommon steady love has become, and they knew it too, even if they refused to admit it. They mistook your consistency for dependence. They mistook your patience for weakness. They mistook your forgiveness for lack of options. But now, as life unfolds without you, they are discovering something uncomfortable. Replacement is not the same as restoration. A new face does not recreate old trust. A new voice does not reproduce familiar understanding. A new relationship does not erase a history of shared endurance. They begin to notice that what they dismissed as ordinary was in fact sacred. You knew their flaws. You endured their moods. You absorbed their criticism, and still you remained. That kind of loyalty is not manufactured. It is given, and when it is given to someone who does not value it, it eventually withdraws. Now they are confronting absence, not dramatic absence, not theatrical loss, but the steady awareness that something foundational is gone. When they face hardship, they realize you would have stood beside them. When they achieve something, they realize you would have celebrated sincerely. When they feel uncertain, they realize you would have offered calm. Instead, they face surfaces, polite conversations, conditional affection, transactional interactions, and they sense the difference. The Apostle James writes that every good and perfect gift comes from above. Sometimes we do not recognize a gift until it is removed. Sometimes familiarity blinds us to value. They assumed you would always be there. They assumed forgiveness was automatic. They assumed loyalty had no expiration. But loyalty without respect cannot survive indefinitely. Now they are watching from a distance. They see your growth. They see your composure. They see your quiet strength. And what unsettles them most is not your success. It is your peace. Because your peace confirms that you were not the problem. Your stability confirms that their narrative was incomplete. Your resilience confirms that you were never weak. They begin to understand that they did not lose convenience. They lost blessing. They lost someone who was aligned with them spiritually. Someone who prayed for them when they did not pray for themselves. Someone who believed in their potential when they were operating beneath it. And the weight of that realization grows heavier over time. Regret matures. It deepens. It becomes less about ego and more about awareness. They may never say it out loud, but in the quiet of their own thoughts, they know. They know they let go of something rare. They know they traded depth for distraction. They know they exchanged commitment for control. And the more they recognize that, the more difficult rest becomes. Because what they lost was not temporary. The collapse of illusion. There comes a moment in every unraveling when illusion can no longer sustain itself. For years, they lived inside a carefully constructed narrative. They were the misunderstood one. They were the strong one. They were the one who always had options. In that narrative, they were never truly at fault, only inconvenienced by other people's overreactions. But illusion requires reinforcement. It must be repeated. It must be defended. It must be believed without interruption. And now, interruption has arrived, not through public disgrace, not through dramatic exposure, but through pattern. Pattern is the quiet destroyer of illusion. When the same arguments reappear in different relationships, when the same accusations surface from different voices, when the same loneliness follows them from room to room, they begin to recognize something unsettling. The problem did not disappear when you left. The dissatisfaction did not vanish with a new face. The tension did not dissolve with a new beginning. It followed them. And repetition is difficult to deny. For someone who built identity on superiority, this is devastating. Because if the pattern continues, the common denominator becomes visible, and visibility threatens pride. They once believed they were always ahead, always smarter, always one move in control. Now they are confronting the possibility that what they called strength was avoidance. What they called confidence was insecurity. What they called independence was isolation. This is the collapse of illusion, not loud, not theatrical, but unmistakable. The image they curated begins to feel hollow even to them. And when a person can no longer believe their own narrative, they begin to fracture internally. But here is where this shifts toward you. Because this message is not about their psychological disintegration. It is about your spiritual positioning. While their illusion collapses, your clarity strengthens. While their identity destabilizes, your integrity solidifies. You did not build your life on control. You built it on conscience. You did not depend on domination. You depended on faith. You did not need to rewrite history. You chose to face it. For those of you in midlife, you understand the beauty of that. You understand that peace is not found in winning arguments. It is found in alignment with truth. You understand that freedom is not control over another person. It is control over your own spirit. When their illusion collapses, it may tempt you to feel vindicated. But this is not about revenge. This is about release. You are not responsible for their reckoning. You are not called to monitor their sleepless nights. You are not assigned to ensure they understand what they lost. God handles exposure. God handles consequence. Your role is different. Your role is to remain steady, to continue healing, to continue growing, to continue walking in dignity. The greatest evidence of divine justice is not their breakdown. It is your restoration. It is your ability to rest at night without rehearsing arguments. It is your ability to move forward without bitterness controlling you. It is your ability to love again without becoming hardened. The collapse of their illusion does not require your participation. It unfolds naturally when pride meets reality. But your peace requires intention. It requires guarding your heart from resentment. It requires trusting that justice does not need your assistance. And this is the final layer of understanding. When illusion collapses, it reveals truth. When truth is revealed, separation becomes necessary. And when separation is accepted, freedom begins. You are no longer entangled in someone else's distortion. You are no longer defending yourself against misrepresentation. You are no longer shrinking to accommodate insecurity. You are standing, not loudly, not arrogantly, but firmly. The narcissist is breaking down because their structure was unsustainable. You are standing because your foundation was different, and foundations determine endurance. Let them wrestle with their narrative collapsing. Let them confront the pattern. Let them face the recognition of what they lost. You do not need to participate, because while they are awake wrestling with illusion, you are learning to rest in truth. And that more than anything is the clearest sign of final judgment at work. Not destruction, but distinction. One life, unraveling under pride. Another life, strengthened under grace.